Dear friends and colleagues, welcome to the third linguistic flash mob. A very warm welcome from me and from all the other organizers of the linguistic aperitif. The hardest times of the COVID-2 crisis are apparently behind us, but we think that we should continue our experiment of scientific proximity on the basis of this environment-friendly, virtual, but nonetheless very real connection. And we want to keep in touch and keep exchanging ideas for scientific research to grow. Today, we have invited two former syntacticians, Luigi Rizzi from the Collège de France and Ángel Gallego from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. They will discuss the topic of minimality and phases in terms of division of labor, and will exchange ideas on locality and give us their view in the form of a contest. They will answer three questions offered by today's moderator, Theresa Biberauer from Churchill College, University of Cambridge, and have, as usual, 5 minutes each to give us their answers to each question. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and then we open the discussion. For security reasons, the chat microphone and screen sharing facilities have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write. Okay, so it's still working. Okay, for those of you who won't be able to ask their questions, you can send them to Maria Rita Manzini via email, and she will collect the question and send them to the speakers for a late reply. Her email address is mariarita.manzini@unifi.it. The event is being streamed on YouTube, so if you ask a question, you're giving implicitly your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of the YouTube registration you have received with a flyer to students and colleagues and post it on the social media. And now I leave the floor to Theresa Biberauer, who will moderate the third epic battle in linguistic history.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And welcome and hello to everybody all over the world. And just a special thank you again to the technical team, which is making it possible for these contests to be as globally accessible as they are. So, and just to say also as an enthusiastic spectator at the first two contests, I'm really delighted to be able to serve as the moderator tonight. So what we've had so far is that these epic battles, they're concerned with truly big topics. So far we've had discussion of parameters, which for a very long time, of course, were pretty much synonymous with the generative syntactic way of thinking. But now in this era, it's a real question what their status is and what the role of UG is and whether more general principles are also involved. And in the second contest, we had an equally big topic, which was this time functional categories, where quite similar questions arise again. And tonight, what we're going to be focusing on is another suitably big topic, so minimality and phases, as you've already heard. And we're delighted to have Luigi Rizzi and Ángel Gallego to debate this topic. So locality, I think it's pretty uncontroversial that the idea that syntactic rules actually operate over a limited domain, it's uncontroversially surely one of the biggest discoveries of the past 60 years or so of generative research. So the fact that we not only are able to meaningfully and productively formulate rules that allow us to capture the formal properties of the structures of natural language, but that actually, it turns out, the rules that allow us to account for the phenomena of natural language, they are limited in the domain over which they apply. That is a surprising and very important finding. And this is, of course, a particularly significant finding, since it seemed at first sight that the relations, the dependencies that hold in syntactic structures seemed at first sight to be able to hold over quite long distances. And that's why we initially were talking about unbounded dependencies. So the fact that natural language syntax doesn't seem to be unrestricted, and that instead there seem to be quite clear limits on the distance over which syntactic rules can apply, over which operations can take place, it's a very exciting discovery. And it's certainly one that's contributed very substantially to the ways in which generativists think about natural language. For example, if we think about the way it's led to the way that we think about the data that actually matters for us. So it's not just what is attested in the input, which is important, and obviously our syntactic rules have to be able to account for that, but equally important is what isn't attested, which syntactic operations, of course, shouldn't be allowing us to generate. And then there's also gradient data, which I expect will come up at some point in the discussion today. Also, if one acknowledges that there are limits to the domains over which syntactic operations can apply, this reinforces the importance of having a very principled approach to how data is approached in generative syntax. So how the data is systematized and analyzed if one wants to get a maximally deep insight from the empirical patterns that we observe. So in making progress on locality, for example, it has been very important, first of all, to start off with a list of what is and what isn't possible, and then to be able to characterize these facts in the kind of way which allows us to move on. So we have to have something which is observationally adequate to start with, but then one wants to be able to carry on to a descriptively adequate characterization, which allows us to be able to make predictions about what we will and won't be able to find in natural languages, and also in natural language acquisition and in language change. And then, of course, there's the question of explanatory adequacy, which arises, and the point where you want to be able to understand why acquirers are able to know not just what movement, agreement, and possibly other operations are possible, but also which dependencies are just systematically not. And in the 21st century, you might even want to go beyond that. But regardless of what you might think about going beyond explanatory adequacy, a question that generative investigation of locality phenomena really illuminates very clearly is that our explanation needs to go beyond the positive impact, the input that child acquirers get. And there must be something else. And again, the question, as we've seen in the previous two contests, is from our 21st century vantage point, the question must be, how much does UG come into play here to restrict the hypotheses that acquirers are willing to entertain, and how much are there maybe more general factors which are in play? Which brings us to the theoretical notions that are our primary focus today, which are minimality on the one hand and phases on the other. So both are notions that have played and continue to play a key role in minimalist work on locality phenomena in the 21st century. Minimality, of course, builds on insights that started with Chomsky in 1964 already, the A over A condition, and that Luigi Rizzi in particular has simultaneously generalized and made much more precise in his work on relativized minimality. And while it started out very much as a representational notion, it's very clear in the minimalist domain that this is something one can very straightforwardly think about in derivational terms too. One just thinks minimal search, fewer steps, and so on. The phase, on the other hand, is a much younger, quite explicitly derivational concept, which was introduced by Chomsky this millennium, and which has been enthusiastically developed in various ways by numerous people, including Ángel Gallego. And the first question that we're going to be considering today is really whether minimalism, which is a framework which, as we know, is strongly committed to minimizing the machinery that is assumed, does it really need both minimality and phases? Is it basically a matter of theoretical taste that some researchers who work on locality problems just seem to reference only one or the other, but not both? Or is there actually some deep redundancy with these notions? Alternatively, is it actually possible, and might it be fruitful, if we try to think seriously about what a division of labor between minimality and phases might look like? So that is question one. Question two turns very specifically to the much debated matter of islands, where we seem to have two different kinds of locality in play. That which involves absolute barriers, which Luigi Rizzi has called impenetrability locality on the one hand, as opposed to that which seems to involve more permeable barriers, which Rizzi has referred to as intervention locality. So here we want to ask questions like, whether phases and minimality respectively and maybe together can help us to understand the difference between these two types of locality, how they might facilitate insight into gradient phenomena potentially, how they might enable us to understand the striking asymmetries in the island domain, and maybe also the cross-linguistic variation that we observe. And the final question is really an identification question. So particularly taking into account that for both minimality and phases, it's been suggested that there is cross-linguistic variation as to what counts as an intervener or a phase. There is a real question about whether we at this point, do we actually have a clear enough intentional definition of minimality and phases to know where we need to look to identify minimality effects, phases, and possibly even the interaction between the two. So those are our questions. Now it's time for the battle to commence with question 1, which, recall, is whether the economy of computational design suggested by all the locality phenomena that we've identified should be ascribed to two distinct concepts, namely minimality and phases. So is there a redundancy between these two? And in the friendly spirit in which these epic battles are being contested, Luigi and Ángel have actually made a gentleman's agreement between them that Luigi will initiate proceedings tonight and that they will then alternate thereafter. So I hand over to Luigi. Luigi?
Can you hear me now? Okay, that's great. Thank you, Theresa. Let me also thank Cecilia and the other organizers for creating this exciting occasion. And let me share the screen with you, hopefully with the right file. All right. Okay, so as for the first question, my short answer is that there can be occasional overlaps between relativized minimality and phase impenetrability, but there's no systematic redundancy. So my view is that the most plausible picture is one of division of labor rather than of theoretical competition. So there are in fact some cases which may suggest redundancy. So the rather obvious case that comes to mind is WH islands. If you take a typical violation of a WH island in a structure like one, this could be ruled out by minimality because WH element crosses another WH element, or by phase impenetrability, because if the edge of the lower CP phase is occupied by WH element, then the other WH element has no way to escape. But in fact, I think there are good reasons to believe that relativized minimality is the only player here. One observation is that the effect that we observe is selective. And this is particularly clear if we take languages like Italian, which are notoriously rather lenient on WH islands. So in Italian, we have that the equivalent of one is essentially ill-formed, as in two. But if we change things a little bit and we extract another type of element, for instance, a relative pronoun, as was pointed out a long time ago, we get a structure like three, which is acceptable. So there is a selectivity, and this is exactly what is expected under relativized minimality, whereas phase impenetrability would predict unselectivity, essentially. So, but then the question is, how do we prevent phase impenetrability to apply in these cases? And here, I think the answer has to do with the fine structure of the CP system. In fact, if we look across languages, we see that in many, many languages, it is clear that the WH element in embedded questions does not occupy the highest position of the CP, because it can be preceded by all sorts of things. So if you take an example like three, in Italian, a topic precedes the WH element, and then there are various other cases that show that the interrogative element is not in the highest position of the embedded CP. So that we want to assume through other assumptions a structure like 4, which is the complete structure of the left periphery. And in this structure, we see that the WH element is in a relatively low position, and then there are other positions, and the phase head presumably is determined by the force head. Hence, the phase hedge is available for further movement, so that if you want to move another element, we have a representation like 5, in which we have moved the element to the phase edge and then to a higher position, so that the only relevant property here is minimality, because in terms of phases, it is possible to extract the element. Now, the important thing here is that I think we should combine phase theory and cartographic representations and systematically ask the question with richer representations of the cartographic kind, what head or what heads define phases. Now, so as I said, the picture that emerges is one of division of labor, in my view. Relativized minimality deals with WH islands, with negative islands, with weak islands in general. The hallmark here is selectivity, right? That's what the principle predicts. Only certain things will not be extractable. And then relativized minimality also applies to cases of A movement. For instance, if you take cases of double object constructions, only the highest object can move in passive, for instance, and that's another reasonable case of intervention. We have intervention effects in adverb movement. For instance, adverbs can be moved to the periphery to be highlighted, things like rapidly John left the room, but this movement cannot take place across a higher adverb in the cinque hierarchy. So again, it's a reasonable intervention effect. And we have intervention effects, I think, in head movement for the cases of the head movement constraint that are empirically correct, for critic movement, and so on and so forth. So selectivity and intervention is taken care of relativized minimality. On the other hand, phase impenetrability condition deals with cases in which intervention is not obviously relevant, like to ensure successive cyclicity from CP and from small VP. We know that there's plenty of cross-linguistic evidence, morphological evidence, for instance, that when we move an element out of an embedded domain, it passes through the edge of the small VP and of the CP and so on and so forth, as is shown by agreement phenomena of various sorts that are discussed in the traditional literature. And also there are phonological effects. For instance, if you take the recent paper by Bianchi, Bocci, and Kurskina, what these authors observe is that even phonological properties like prominence assignment are sensitive to the transition of the WH element from the edge of the small VP. So there's plenty of evidence of different kinds suggesting that this movement takes place through the edges. But here, at least at first sight, intervention is not relevant. There's nothing obvious that forces this kind of movement. And so here, the PIC seems to be the only player. And similarly for strong islands. Strong islands, by definition, non-selective islands are the domain of the PIC. So that's my more articulated answer to the first question. Let me stop sharing and leave the floor to Ángel.
Right, thank you very much, Luigi. Ángel.
Okay, yes, hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Hi to everyone. Like Luigi, I would like to thank Cecilia and all the other organizers for coming up with these ideas about this discussion. Also thanks to Theresa for helping us. Okay, I'm going to share also my PowerPoint. Okay, so this is it. Just to go back to the 3 questions, we have to say something about Is there a redundancy between phases and minimality? What about islands? And which are the relevant properties that determine the facial heads and intervention effects? So just to advance the short answers, I'm going to sketch in this PowerPoint. The first answer to the answer to the first question is no. The second answer is going to be that islands cannot be totally reduced to one phases or the other, minimality. And I believe for the third question, which remember is this one, which are the relevant properties that determine facial heads and intervention effects? I fear, or that's what I'm going to argue at least, that there is no short answer to that. So with respect to the first question, is there a redundancy between phases and minimality? So my answer is going to be no. So in this respect, I align with Luigi's position. So and actually, I think that more generally, this question and question two, they go back to a possible unification of cyclicity and islands. And I think, or at least that's my perception, that most, if not all, attempts have failed in achieving this desired unification. An important example of this is Chomsky's barriers, but we also had previous examples of that attempt of unification, like conditions on transformation. Now, going to a more detailed answer. So on the one hand, I think we have. So it is well established, I think, that phases capture strict cyclicity, so intercyclic dependencies. And this is a more derivational notion. Now, there are different ways of capturing the idea that there is no backtracking. So there is some principle, and this principle has received different labels in the literature, and many of them actually coexist, which is something that I'm going to say something about later on. So you have the extension condition, the no tampering condition, the phase impenetrability condition, and there are others. Now, on the other hand, minimality, at least standard versions, it captures intracyclic dependencies, and it is a more representational notion. Therefore, like I said before, and like Luigi pointed out, there should be no redundancy, and I think that for the most part, that is the case. Now, some yellow flags that one may raise is what about what would happen in a scenario where Chomsky's PIC would not remove material from the computation, which is an idea that he has been defending in different papers in the last years? Or what would happen if movement to the edge, which is a notion anchored to phase theory, is subject to feature checking, which is a notion anchored to minimality, as Klaus Abels discussed. Also, phases are defined in terms of 5 features, which in turn they are connected to the operation agree, and this is also something that minimality requires. So we are used to seeing minimality being related to some kind of feature interaction, and this is also something that defines phases, and this will take us back to question 3. Now, also, and this is something that Omer Preminger pointed out in an email that he sent, and also in a blog. So he discussed that he made an interesting point, and I think this is actually what we are supposed to do here, not only like answering the question and seeing what has been said or discussed in the literature, but actually posing new questions and rethinking the findings that we have. And actually, so it's Luigi and me that happen to be the ones to be talking, but I hope that this can be a very active discussion forum afterwards. So like Omer pointed out, if every phrase is a phase, which is something that has been said by many authors, then phasehood could be indeed reduced to minimality. And as we will see later on, I will try to provide some arguments why that shouldn't be the case. And this is also connected to question 3. And just as mentioned before, and I think this is a very big question that should be floating around the answers that we provide to the 3 questions. So the attempt to unify notions So if we just focus on the notions that have been related to the idea of phase or cycle or bounding node, there are many different labels that have been used and that are used to define a very similar notion or to cover very similar phenomena. So you have minimality, no tampering condition, the extension condition, the PIC, and others. And this is, I think, something that we should reflect about. This is something that Luigi and I talked about the other day, which is something that may trigger some kind of hesitation or frustration within the current situation of the field. So where you find many, and this may be actually something good, something natural, a part of how science works. But when you see that the same bunch of phenomena are being treated by 10, maybe 12, maybe 15, or maybe more different analyses, then you sort of lose grasp of what the basic questions are and how to approach the phenomena and how to understand that part of natural language. And that's going to be that for the first question. So let me return the control. Okay, is that
yep,
is that okay? Okay,
that's great. Thank you very much, Ángel and Luigi. Right, so that is question 1 taken care of, which means that we move on to question 2, which is about islands. And as per prior agreement, Ángel, I believe it's you again.
Yes, okay, let me do that again. Okay, let's share. Okay, so here we go again. Okay, so what about islands? Yes, so just like I pointed out, on the one hand here, with respect to the second question, we know, at least from barriers, that work showed that it is not possible to collapse phases or any, I mean, whatever version you want to have of phases, adjacency, and islandhood. I mean, that was an ambitious project, and I think one that should not be abandoned, but one that was not successful, I think. Likewise, islands are subject to variation. You have variation with respect to weak islands, to the subjunctive indicative distinction, and other things. And so there are tense-related islands. There are other kind of islands where you see variation in a way that phases do not seem to be. So there are cases where it has been argued, I have argued myself, that phases may be subject to some kind of minor adjustment or parameterization. But I think that in principle, those objects behave in a more stable way with less variation than the one we see with respect to islands. Now, on the other hand, there are clear points in common. So the typology of islands is as diverse as the typology of phases, and this is something, again, that should worry us, but at the same time that should be taken as an opportunity to go back to square one and maybe re-ask the basic questions and rethink whether what we're doing is just coming up with a list of phenomena or facts, or whether we are trying to pin down the actual very basic questions. Now, also another point in common that these objects have is that complex specifiers, they yield islands and edges, which is the second one is a notion related to the to phase theory. Okay. Now, island effects are also subject to satiation effects in a way that phases do not seem to be. Also, another interesting point that we can go back to in the question period is that island circumvention strategies like resumption, pipe piping, and others, they also suggest that these objects, that islands, they require an independent approach, which in turn raises well-known debates about the distinction between the grammar and the parser. So, and in this respect, which is another topic that we can elaborate on, it's not clear to me how everything can be, how all the facts can be related to parsing given at least given the fact that Wang showed with respect to languages that do not display WH movement but do display island effects. Just to finish with this slide, another well-known fact about adjuncts, which are islands, they fail to display properties associated to an agree-based issues like case, binding, and extraction, which are more connected to phases and to minimality. Now, from a current perspective, also unifying argument and adjunct islands does not seem to work either. So consider, for instance, the examples in 1 and 2. Who do you think the police killed, or who do you not think the police killed? That's I mean, both cases are okay when you try to extract an argument. But the moment you try to do the same with an adjunct, like for what reason, and I'm using this long adjunct so that there is no minimality related thing. So for what reason did you think the police killed Floyd? Or for what reason did you not think the police killed Floyd? So again, introducing not makes adjunct extraction bad. An effect that does not hold for argument extraction. So why? So this indicates that, again, a possible unification about those types of islands is not obvious. Now, similar considerations can be made with ellipses with respect to the impossibility of trying to get this unification, at least within the realm of islands. So we know that we can somehow restore. I mean, we can delete or destroy island effects by means of sluicing, by means of ellipses. So we can have something like in 3, who did you see a policeman who killed? That's ruled out. But if you try to do that with the sluicing, I saw a policeman who killed someone, but I don't know who. That's okay. But notice in 4, then when we try to do the same thing with an adjunct, the thing does not work. So why did you see a policeman who killed Floyd? That's out. And the same happens. So it's also out to say, I saw a policeman who killed Floyd for a reason, but I don't know why, or I don't know what reason. Okay. Now, also some questions that I think should be put over the table with respect to the discussion, to any discussion of islands. 2 more questions is that maybe what we call islands, all of them, all the typology that we have, maybe they are not the same kind of entities, and this again goes back to the possibility of having located the actual basic elements, basic concepts, basic questions that we want to address. Again, and this, I am relating this to a possible rethinking of our primitives. And also another question that would be interesting to raise is whether whenever we find a different set of phenomena or something that does not work in the way we expect, whether the solution to that should be the postulation of a new principle or a new operation. For instance, in the case of adjuncts, we have a different operation that has been argued for in the case of this dependence, pair merge. So do we need to go that road whenever we find something that does not behave in the way we would like it to behave? That's another thing that I think is good reflecting on. And I think that's it on my part. Let me return the control.
Thank you very much, Ángel.
Okay.
Right. I will hand straight over to Luigi.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can. Okay. All right, so, okay, islands. So I agree with much of what Ángel said. I think islands clearly are a major empirical discovery of generative grammar. So it's a real and substantive contribution to the understanding of human language. Now, why did generative grammar discover islands and not other frameworks or other approaches to language? Well, presumably this is linked to the emphasis on movement that is characteristic of generative grammar. you need some clear concept of movement in order to detect islands. Otherwise, you just not notice the phenomenon. So we have a detailed catalog of descriptive catalog of islands, and we have a number of theoretical players to account for them. We talked about minimality, we talked about phase impenetrability, and then there are other elements that can come into the picture for a theoretical understanding of islands. One is freezing effects. This is not directly related to island properties, but it has something in common with islands in the sense that in freezing configurations, we typically cannot move an element that should otherwise be able to move. So freezing configurations deal with the vast class of dead trace effects, fixed subject constraints. Then in turn, freezing effects may be accounted for in terms of more elementary theoretical entities such as labeling and perhaps more abstract principles. Moreover, it has been suggested in recent work that certain aspects of the coordinate structure constraint may be traced back to freezing effects. Interesting proposal, I think. Then there's the whole domain of extractions from specifiers that Ángel mentioned. So we have all these cases in which a specifier is an island. We have the subject condition. We have constraints on extractions from left branches. We have CD effects, and CDs also can be seen as cases of impossible extraction from specifiers if one adopts a theory of adverbial elements a la cinque, in which they are generated in the specifier position of certain dedicated functional heads. And as we know, there is a detailed literature that somehow gives theoretical content to all these observations. Now, let me make one observation, a theoretical observation of a certain tension that arises between the existence of several constraints on the extraction from specifiers and smuggling derivations. Now, if you think of smuggling derivations, whose relevance is becoming apparent in all sorts of constructions, in a sense, smuggling is an anti-island effect, right? It's an effect that allows the grammar to circumvent a blocking effect of some sort. But then smuggling crucially involves some extraction from a specifier, from something that is a left branch, in fact, in the configuration that is created by the operation. So this raises the interesting theoretical question of what makes extraction from a specifier possible in some cases, in fact, as a device to avoid an island, and impossible in other cases. Let me mention an important methodological innovation, which is obviously relevant for the study of islands, which is the systematic use of controlled experiments for gathering grammaticality judgments or for gathering other types of data. Now, why is it that controlled experiments are so important for the study of islands? Well, this has to do with the particular nature of the empirical evidence that characterizes islands, that is to say, the fact that very often we observe gradations of acceptability, something that both Theresa and Ángel mentioned, right? This is a familiar property, but what we observe is that if we ask an absolute judgment on certain types of islands, we get a lot of variation across speakers. Some accept it more or less, others do not. But if we ask relative questions, that is to say, is A better than B, we get much more stable results across speakers. And controlled experiments are a way to obtain these hierarchies of acceptabilities. Now here, let me also mention a theoretical questions. Current syntactic models are considered not well equipped to deal with gradations, right? Typically, we assume binary distinction. So either the grammar can generate a certain structure, then it's in, or it doesn't generate the structure, and then it's out. But in fact, what we observe in the empirical data is that there are these systematic gradients, these systematic gradations. So one typical answer is that the gradation is traced back, is often traced back to the interaction between grammar, which per se is binary, and other systems, performance systems, memory, and so on and so forth, properties that interact with the grammar to determine the graded character. But I think this is not the only way to go. So the dichotomic character of the grammar is not a necessary property of formal linguistic models. In some areas, it is possible to see how certain gradations could become grammatical explananda, that is to say, properties on which the grammar has something significant to say. And I'd like to discuss some cases of this sort in my answer to the third question, but for the moment, I will just raise the theoretical question here and stop on this point.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Right. So we've just had mention of the third question. We have indeed already reached the final round. So remember, the final question was about the extent to which it's possible for us to meaningfully identify the properties that we would ascribe to minimality and to phases. So I think there again, Luigi is going to start. He is just, yep, I'll hand over.
Thank you. Okay, so there we go. Third question. Let me first say something about phases and then talk about the ingredients that are relevant for minimality. Now, about phases, it seems to me that a property that makes CP and small vp reasonable candidates for phasehood is the fact that both these categories have peripheries, in the sense that they are populated by sequences of dedicated scope discourse positions. So we have a high periphery associated with the complementizer system and a low periphery in the sense of Adriana Belletti's work. And these peripheries are endowed with positions of like topic, focus, maybe queue for questions, and so on. And these peripheries connect these structural domains directly to the interface systems with pragmatics and discourse. So the presence of these peripheries seems to me to make it plausible to consider these categories phases, because in this sense, CP and small vp manifest the relative independence in terms of interface properties that Chomsky considers defining characteristic of phases. Now, as I already mentioned, an important issue that arises for both peripheries is the combination of cartographic representations and phase theory. This is to say, we want to know what head or what heads of the expanded CP system, of the expanded VP, small VP system counts as a phase head. Now, in the case of CP, rather obvious, straightforward suggestion is that force is a plausible phase head, but the thing should be considered with care, and it's impossible to exclude that there may be something more interesting and more articulated to say about phasehood and CPs. And for VP, small VPs, the same questions arise. Clearly, we want representations in which we do not just have a single category, small v. It's as implausible as assuming CP systems with just one C category or IP systems with just one I category. So, and then in whatever expanded structure turns out to be right, the question of phasehood is to be asked. Now, about minimality, I think the picture is that something cannot move across an intervener. So movement from Y to Z to X in 7 is impossible if there is an intervener Z which is of the same type as X. And how do we define types of positions? I think the relevant notion here is the notion of formal syntactic feature. By formal syntactic features, I mean features that are visible to the syntactic machine, features that are syntactically active, that define positions, participate in labeling, license movement, whatever one means by licensing of movement, either directly by triggering or perhaps in some more indirect fashion. So these features, visible to syntax, are what determine the typology of positions that is responsible for minimality effects. Notice that it's not the case that any imaginable feature would count for minimality effects, right? So purely phonological features never count. So we never have specific intervention effects that are determined by elements that share certain phonological properties, like being a rhyming pair, for instance, no such minimality effect. Or purely semantic features like, you know, features characterizing human professions or, I don't know, flying animals. These properties, purely semantic features, do not have an impact on syntax and do not determine minimality effects of any kind. So it seems to me that the notion of formal syntactic feature is well defined enough to be a solid basis on which to build typology of positions that we need for minimality effects. And as usual, there's a core of cases which is completely clear, and then there is a periphery on which argument and debate is needed, but that's the property of all the properties of all the elements that we play with in theoretical syntax. Now let me drop what I wanted to say about negative violence, and let me just focus for a moment on gradation. So a typical observation is that with weak islands, for instance, extraction from a WH island, we get degrees of ill-formedness. So for instance, in these cases, illustrating combien sub-extraction in French, there's a clear gradient. If in cases like 8, we extract the bare Q quantifier, we get from a WH island, we get a strong violation. Then if we move, as in 9, a lexically restricted Q operator, we get a milder violation. And then if we have movement, either of the bare quantifier or of the lexically restricted quantifier in a context in which there is no intervener, of course, the structure is fully acceptable as in 10. So in these cases, it's pretty straightforward to look at the degree of deviance as a function of the featural match between the target and the intervener, right? So when the target is featurally identical to the intervener, strong deviance. When the target is richer, so that we have an inclusion situation as in 9, we get a milder violation. And when there's no intervention, of course, there's no violation. And then here we have a tripartite gradation, but we can multiply degrees if we take into account other features. Okay, so in this way, I think certain gradations can be captured directly by the grammar. As you know, this idea proved very relevant also to deal with acquisition properties, certain difficulties that children have with certain A-bar constructions like object relatives, certain object questions can be dealt with in this way and by assuming a kind of a strong intolerance by children or any kind of featural overlap between target and intervener. And more generally, I think as soon as formal syntactic features become a player, we have a way within the grammar of expressing, capturing graded judgments as a function of the degree of feature overlap in the way that I illustrated. And I will stop at this point.
Thank you.
Okay, so
right, yeah, Ángel, fire ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me do this again. Okay, so my answer actually to this third and last question is going to be much shorter, and I think that will actually be good because we will have more time for discussion. Now, so the question was, which are the relevant properties that determine phasal heads and intervention effects? And this question, as you see here in my slide, only makes sense from an agree-centered perspective where you have features to play with. And here I think this is one corner where the options that one may find in the literature literally explode. With respect to phase theory, I think there is no agreed upon take on what phases are or what are the phases. There is probably some consensus, as Luigi mentioned, with respect to CP and VP, and perhaps there are more arguments in favor of the phasal status of clauses of CPs. The ones that have to do with the VP are a bit more technical and subtler. And then things get triggered when you move to DPs or PPs. And I think more or less something similar happens, or at least that's my impression when we take a look at features, which are very important if we try to more or less understand what kind of options we have when taking a look at minimality or dependencies of that sort. So with respect to phase theory, as everyone knows, so the notion originally was related to some poorly defined or not well justified, I think, notion of complexity that was invoked by Chomsky in his 2000 paper. From that, he started playing with the idea that those domains had to do with small portions of lexical items, numerations, lexical arrays. There are different notions for those. Then also other effects were incorporated into the picture, like semantic effects of different sorts, phonological effects of different sorts, along with other syntactic effects. And then, like I said before, I had the impression for a while, I still have it, then the options literally explode. So you had C and V at the beginning, then also maybe prepositions and determiners. Then you can very easily find many papers where every projection has been argued to be a phase. Also, every application of merge, which is a different, slightly different scenario. Also predications. So, and when you see that all these options, which are actually quite diverse, are considered for a theoretical notion that should provide us with some kind of unification and understanding, then I think, at least in my case, that's what happened to me. I had a sensation of I don't know, surprise, hesitation, frustration. And again, this may be part of how things go, and at some point we will be able to really determine whether only those, I mean, whatever X and Y objects are phases because of such and such criteria. But I think at this point, it very much depends. This is something that Luigi and I were also talking about the other day. So perhaps I'm exaggerating, but it very much depends on the author you read. So the definition of phase actually can vary that much. Now the question is, how can we tell which one is the maybe this is not the most appropriate adjective, but which one is the correct approach? I don't want to put it in terms of being correct or not, but But that's something that may worry us. So that's one thing. And we would like to conclude, and this is something that also I am presenting it here, but this is something that Luigi and I talked about. So apart from the discussion that we are having and that we are about to have right now in the question period, I think this is a very good opportunity for us to be able to locate problems which can actually be taken as opportunities to reconsider and rethink how everything works. So after this discussion, and before we open the debate to all the people that are attending, we would like to send an encouraging, or what we think can be an encouraging and optimistic take-home message, that is, instead of simply taking a look at the literature, which is always and also important and crucial, we should probably try to look ahead and consider things from a different perspective. So and perhaps we need more interaction, and now we have the means to have much more interaction than 10 years ago, or 10 or 20, or not to mention 30 years ago. So we need more attempts to seek answers in a collective fashion. And so, but before we do that, we probably need to rethink what the basic questions are, given the phenomena we know, given the data we have collected. And this again should ideally lead to at least a partial unification, which is, I think, what all these three questions are dealing with. So the possibility of unifying key notions in syntactic theory. Okay, so I will leave it here, just mentioning that so I would like to thank all these people that I talked about when preparing this talk, and I think we are all ready for the question period. So you can shoot, everyone. Okay, so let me return the control.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ángel and Luigi. Okay. Right, so it's very clear from what you've both been saying that you're as eager as I think everybody at this flash mob is to really have some discussion. So I'm not going to be taking up a lot of time. I think it was just very interesting, just to summarize, that we had these three questions, and that on the first one, which is about, are we dealing with redundancy when we have both phases and relativized minimality, I think we had complete agreement. Both of you were saying absolutely not. It seems quite clear that there's a very sensible division of labor that we can see quite clearly if we consider the quite different phenomena that we're trying to understand. So selectivity and intervention is much more relativized minimality type of thing, whereas the cyclicity effects look much more like we need phases, PIC, and so on. And also that attempts at unification, we've had past experience with that, so maybe we should be not too hasty in trying to get rid of notions when clearly there is quite a diversity of phenomena to understand. And that also came up, I think, in the responses and the thoughts that you raised in relation to the question of islands, where there was again agreement that the data are clearly very, very complex, and that it may well be that there may be too many notions flying around, and that we may well want to rethink or basically try to reduce some of these notions, maybe to more primitive notions that we already have in the theory. But clearly that there's potentially space for both phases and minimality there as well. And then also very interestingly, Luigi raised the experimental turn, which I think is just, personally, I think is worth emphasizing, because that's something maybe that formal linguistics, generative linguistics isn't necessarily always connected to sufficiently. And then finally, we had the question about the extent to which we're in a position to actually reliably identify the notions that we're working with, these concepts of phase and an intervention effect, for example. And interestingly, Ángel was much more cautious about saying there's a clear-cut way of identifying phases. So from his point of view, that's still something which requires a lot of work, and there's a potentially dangerous sounding explosion of ideas there. But Luigi did suggest that maybe we might want to think about phases as being heads which have a periphery, so that means they're privileged in the sense that they interact with the interfaces in a special way. So that's something potentially worth thinking about. And clearly that what we've learned about cartography needs to be linked up with the thinking that we have in phases. So again, bringing us back to a division of labor and bringing these notions together. And then there was also discussion of the importance of syntactic features in helping us to understand these phenomena. So I think all of those things, I can see a whole lot of questions have come up. So let me just see. Yes, Alessandra Giorgi, you have a question, so we can hear that, please.
Oh, okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. My question is the following. If, as also pointed out in these brief answers by Gallego, one of the approach is intrinsically derivational and the other is intrinsically representational, then it seems to me that the issue concerning the division of labor becomes tricky, because even if it might be argued that derivational and representational approaches can be reduced one to the other, still I believe that there is a difference between the two, at least in terms of computational complexity. So I wonder how the division of labor goes together with this different characterization of the two approaches. Thank you. Then my question is to both speakers.
You want to go first, Luigi, or?
Sure. Maybe I'll just say one thing. Well, it seems to me that the issue of derivational versus representational character is orthogonal to the issue of whether we have two principles or not. So I can see ways of expressing both principles representationally, both principles derivationally, and in mixed ways. So that is not critical, it seems to me. I've always expressed minimality in representational terms, but if you express it derivationally, let's say in terms of attract the closest element, exactly the same observations that I made hold about the fact that once we have cartographic representations of the CP, we have an independent escape hatch, even that the WH element occupies a lower position, right? So that seems to me not to be critical. Now, I briefly mentioned in my slides the recent paper by Chomsky, Gallego, and Ott, by saying that if my understanding of that paper is correct, in fact, they also have to arrive at the conclusion that relativized minimality is representational, because if movement is free, essentially it's not triggered by probe goal configuration, I think it's inevitable, as we see minimality effects, to have a principle evaluating the structure at the representational level. But maybe Ángel wants to say something about that.
No, yes, I have the same impression. So I was going to give the same answer. I think that the representational derivational distinction is not actually crucial. So you can recast, you can reformulate a given representational principle in derivational terms, in terms of the minimal link condition or attract the closest. Now, so in this respect, I go back to the answer we both provided to this first question, that there is a division of labor. So there are some cases, there are some situations where one could argue whether you can reduce one to the other, and that's for instance the discussion that Omer had in his blog. But now, and with respect to the last point that you mentioned, Luigi, with respect to features, and this is something that I wanted to comment more when I was using the slides, is so our position with respect to movement is that it's free, so you don't need feature checking. So in this respect, we are more skeptical with respect. So the facts are what they are. So the data that we have collected, they are what they are. But we are more skeptical with respect to the introduction of different features in the derivation. So if they are not there, they should be somewhere, maybe in the interface with the semantic component or somewhere. But again, I think at the end of the day, it's something that was already mentioned in aspects. So you can make your theory more robust or bigger in one side. So you can put all that stuff, all that material in the syntax, or either you can do that in the semantics or wherever you want to put it. So it's a matter of where you are going to place that kind of technology in order to understand the facts. So from our perspective, putting those features, provided that we have a theory more or less of what the syntactic features are, which I think we don't. But if we had one, for us, it's much more unclear that they are going to be in the derivation, so they should be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. May I just add one comment on that? That is why, precisely because I had in mind this kind of picture that you are presenting, that's why I said relevant formal features are features that license movement either directly, if one takes the prop goal framework, mm-hmm. or indirectly. But you still need some indirect way of accounting for the fact that movement to a certain position can take place or cannot take place to that position. So whether it's done in the syntax or at the level of evaluation, post-syntactic evaluation, still some features are never relevant in that sense. So if you take purely semantic features, like those that I mentioned, purely phonological features, it never happens that you move to a certain syntactic position, something that starts with a vowel or that has 3 syllables rather than 4, or that forms a rhyming pair with some other element, right? So we still need a distinction between features that license movement directly or indirectly and features that do not do anything to syntactic operations like these other features. So the distinction, I think, still holds.
Right, I think we have agreement among our combatants on that question. So let's move on to the next one, which it looks to me like Omer Preminjo, you were the next.
Yeah, so actually the speakers covered a good amount of the territory of this question because my question had a lot of overlap with Alessandra's. But I do want to push back on one point that actually there seemed to be agreement on, so let me disagree, which is that the derivational or representational characterization of minimality are roughly interchangeable. And here's, I think, the empirical wedge that I would try to drive between this. You have a lot of cases cross-linguistically where it's been argued that a probe tries to reach a goal, it's intervened with, something then happens to the intervener. Immediately thereafter, the next probe manages to see across where the intervener used to be. Assuming that not all those cases are wrongly analyzed, I think that tells you that you can't get away from a derivational component to minimality unless you want to do something which is like submit the whole representation to representational evaluations at every step, which seems like a reductio ad absurdum of what it means to be a representational constraint anyway. So I'd like to hear how you would think of those types of cases.
May I say something? Yeah. Actually, I do not know exactly what cases you have in mind, but what I can tell you is that at some point I tried to give exactly that sort of argument for a representational view of relativized minimality. Essentially, the argument was that you have to evaluate representations in the domain of weak islands. So maybe what you have in mind is some different domain, I don't know. But in the domain of weak islands, I try to argue that you have to apply relativized minimality on constructions that have, on representations that have undergone reconstruction and readjustment or reconstructed structures of the kind that Fox talks about, right? So the argument was precisely that as you have to deal with reconstructed structures on which Fox's arguments have, Fox's operations have already applied, you've got to have a representational view of relativized minimality. So in a sense, it's the opposite of the kind of argument that you were giving conceptually. Then empirically, I don't know. I'm not sure I understand what you have in mind, even though
what I have in mind What I had in mind was just the treatment of person number asymmetries in domains like the PCC, but also things that are only PCC-like, like Sigurdsson and Holmberg's work on Icelandic and so forth, where you get intervention for one probe and then the intervener is either moved or clitic doubled, and immediately the next probe can see right past that position, which seems to require representational evaluation at very close stages of the derivation. If you want to do it representationally.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, this actually reminded me of the discussion that Chomsky had with respect to the evaluation at the phase level. So you do everything derivationally. There are operations applying, but you evaluate intervention effects at the end of the phase, so not at every step. So this is something similar, if I remember. And again, so even if we accept that representational principles can be stated in a derivational fashion, there may be phenomena that are only easily accommodated in a derivational way. For instance, I'm thinking of the discussion that Hornstein and Uriagareca had with respect to LF islands with quantifiers. So that's one case where I think derivational approach is maybe more satisfactory to a purely representational one. But again, that even if we go the derivational way, there may be some situations where you want to evaluate a partial representation, not the whole thing, but at least a partial representation. And the debate there is what that partial representation is, what the phase is. I don't know if this provides you with an answer, Homer.
Right. He looks like he's happy to think about that. Brilliant. Okay, so I think David Pazetsky, you were next. We can't hear you.
Right, I was muted. Yeah, so I have a question that came into my mind while listening to the very beginning of Luigi's first presentation, but of course it's a question for both of you. But thinking about the particular Luigi's first two slides. And so historically in the field as a whole, the investigation of movement, but especially A-bar movement, has focused mostly on the movement of nominal arguments, and only later and more peripherally in the literature on the movement of non-nominal non-arguments, or what we call adjuncts. Right? And it's focusing on the extraction of nominals that the kinds of contrasts that were mostly discussed here by both Luigi and Ángel emerged, as data. So the relative acceptability of relativization extracting from a question in Italian that Luigi discovered and was on his first or second slide, versus trying to do the same thing with interrogative WH movement getting out of an embedded question, or phenomena like satiation effects, which Ángel mentioned, or interspeaker variability that Luigi focused on in one of his slides. And I think it's a fact that if you focus on movement of non-nominal non-arguments like why or how or French combien, we see a very different picture of a global nature. So it's true that movement of these sorts of things obeys some constraints that are not found at all phenomenals, like the blocking effect of negation, for instance. But I think the following, which is people pay less attention to, though it's ended up actually dominating islands when I teach it in classes, because it's the most effective way to teach islands, I've discovered, which is that I think every domain that blocks nominal extraction to any degree, with or without satiation effects, any domain practically that any linguist has ever said, that's an island, without any interspeaker variation, it seems to be an absolute and total barrier to extraction of non-nominals, non-arguments. Right? So why and how, combien, and so forth. So whether it's a WH island of any sort, or the weakest of complex noun phrase constraint effects, or topic islands, anything that I know of that's ever been called an island blocks getting non-nominal non-arguments out of them. And that doesn't seem to be in any obvious way just a parsing effect, because to the extent that I understand these things, you get the same phenomena in WH and C2 constructions. Longobardi years ago showed LF effects in English that have that character as well. So it seems to be the domains that block non-nominal non-argument extraction are a proper superset of those that affect nominals. And I'm not sure we know why. And it's not obvious to me that the division of labor perspective urged particularly by Luigi today helps us here. Because I can't figure out under minimality, for instance, what intervener at an embedded question or complex noun phrase boundary is going to be more poisonous to why than to what. Nor does cartography, at least the particular slide that Luigi had, in any obvious way help us, because I don't know why how or as many, the relative counterpart of combien, should move through a different position when exiting a clause than who or what should do. So this seems to me to be an open puzzle. I don't have a solution, but one that might cast the discussion in a different light. And I'm eager to hear what Luigi and Ángel have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. Can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm
asking Theresa because I see Theresa somewhere.
Hey, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, it's an important question. It is clear that a purely featural approach would predict a kind of cross-classification that would not lead to the kind of subset, superset phenomenon like the one you are alluding to. So that I think that's an important observation and clearly cannot be treated purely in featural terms. I do not have a real answer to your question, but it seems to me that if you look at the movement options and at the features that you can stick on elements and make them available to movement, there is a difference between fundamentally the nominal domain and the domain of other things that you were referring to, right? So it is much harder to focalize through movement a non-nominal element. We know that there are plenty of languages with verbal focalization, verbal clefts, and so on and so forth. But notice that very typically in these cases, in African languages, for instance, Kwa languages and so on, what you do is you first nominalize the verb, and then you can focalize it, right? So similarly for WH, right? You can stick the WH or Q feature to a nominal element, kind of an extended sense, but it's very hard to do that with a verbal element unless you nominalize it in some way, so that the class of movement options available to non-nominal elements is more reduced. And that may be, in part, the reason for your observation, even though it's a very important question on which I certainly do not have a complete answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Rita has a question or two from people watching on YouTube. So I'll hand over to Rita to hand those out, to read those out.
Yes, if you can hear me, some of the questions I got have already been asked, but I have an interesting question from Bob Frieden for both of you. And so I'll read it out. Is it possible that cyclicity is derived from neither minimality nor phases? I've published 2 papers that show how cyclicity is derived from A, the formulation of the basic structure building operation, merge, or possibly simply from the no tampering condition. And he quotes the 2 papers, Cyclicity and Minimalism, 99, and Cyclicity and Syntax in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Linguistics. So we haven't heard about this before. So please.
For Ángel.
Okay. So I will break the ice this time. Yes, I would agree. So I wouldn't say that cyclicity follows from any of those. So in that respect, I would agree. And yes, I would align with an answer that would relate that notion to the very existence of merge in principle. So I would actually go for that option instead of going for the no tampering condition, which in very respects is a notion very similar to the PIC in a sense, and there are many problems and situations where it seems that the NTC does not quite work, and I think it's more basic, more justified to go for the merge option. And so the very existence of internal merge would provide, I think, a way out to capture or to justify the existence of cyclicity. Then the questions arise with respect to whether what kind of paths you have. You have punctuated paths, or you have movement stopping at every specifier every time you apply internal merge to some syntactic object. But I think trying to reduce, trying to derive, trying to relate cyclicity to the very existence of merge, in particular the internal version of that, would make sense to me.
Luigi?
Yeah, no, I basically agree. So I think that cyclicity, in a sense, it's a very basic property of language that clearly doesn't follow from locality in any obvious sense. So it seems to me that unless we say that all categories, well, certainly intervention is not relevant for cyclicity. That's not what determines cyclicity. And unless you assume that all categories are phases, and these are proposals that have been made, it's clear that cyclicity is a more general phenomenon because it involves also categories that are not phasal. So I think cyclicity, in a sense, it's an independent property that has to do, I agree with Ángel, with the way in which we see the operational merge fundamentally, that it just adds successive pieces. And so it's not derived from the locality considerations that we are considering.
Right. Thank you very much. I think we have Klaus Abels or Luisa Marti. I'm not sure. Are you there?
Klaus Abels.
Great, Klaus.
Yes. So my question cuts a little bit in the other direction of Bob Frieden. So it's nice that it comes right afterwards. So while I can perfectly see and understand, and I've written about this, how successive cyclicity and phases can be connected to each other, at least Luigi seemed to take it for granted that there is a role of phases in for our theory of islands, and I just don't quite don't quite understand that. So maybe you can, Luigi, you can elaborate on how you see this, because it seems to me that once you have phases and you have movement to phase edges, then your theory of islands won't come from the theory of phases, and in particular some of the strong island effects that we know. There, you can take the same phrase, and depending on where in the tree you stick it, right? That's the nature. That's a puzzle about the CED, about conditional extraction domains. Depending on where you stick a particular phrase, it's going to either act as an island or not, and phases are not going to help you there in any obvious way.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, as you may remember from my slide, I put the CED effects in the category of possibility or impossibility of extraction from a specifier, which were distinct from the other cases, which had to do with complements, basically, right? So what I said before had to do with complements. So some complements are transparent, some other complements are not transparent, and that I tried to account for in terms of minimality. Now, what does this have to do with strong islands? The case of strong island that I had in mind was in fact relative islands, right? Because if you take the system that I outlined, there is one situation in which the presence of an element determines a strong island, and this is when the highest specifier of the phase is occupied by something, right? So if a certain element, let's say a relative pronoun, for instance, occupies the highest position in the phase, in terms of my old system, the specifier of force, then this becomes a strong island because you don't have a way of getting out from that structure. It's only when the element stops in a lower position in the CP periphery that you have the possibility of always using the phase edge for extraction, and then you only have the minimality effects with the selectivity and so on and so forth. So the basic simple-minded idea is that a weak island becomes a strong island when the highest position is occupied. And the model I had in mind was relatives. Now, about the other cases, I do not have an immediate application of that idea to CED, for example. So I kept them aside for that reason.
But relative clauses fall under the CED, right? They're non-arguments, they're non-complements.
Well, it depends. It depends. There are theories of relative clauses in which they are in fact selected elements, so that it's not entirely obvious that they fall under the CED.
Okay.
Okay, Klaus is willing to accept that. Time is moving on, so we're going to have one last, I believe it's a comment from Ian Roberts.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, this is actually really a follow-up to David Pasetsky's question. Well, as I say, it's a comment rather than a question. It seems to me that I fully take his point about nominal extraction of, extraction of non-nominals, adjuncts of various kinds, reveals island effects in the sort of sharpest way. And there's something profound there that we're kind of missing, seemingly, that we're not fully understanding. There's a kind of pendant to that, it seems to me, which arises from Boskovich's work on the extended CNPC, which is that actually you can't really extract from any complex lexical category except verbal ones. And so it seems that we always seem to think of complex noun phrases as kind of exceptional domains from which extraction was impossible. But actually, it's complex verb phrases, extended verb phrases, which are the exceptional domains because you can extract from them. And it seems to me that there's some very profound point there that we're also missing. And maybe in the spirit of Angel's last slide, if we want to try and think in new ways, we need to try to put these 2 points together, and it might give us a different take on the whole set of empirical issues, rather than in fact the theoretical issues.
This is for Ángel.
Okay, yes. Yeah, and actually there was something I wanted to mention with respect to David's question. Yes, I think there is a very interesting distinction with respect to how nominals behave on the one hand, and then the other stuff, which basically brings us back to some version of Chomsky's lexical categories in the 70s. So like Luigi, I don't have an answer to that question. So the standard answer, the label answer may or may be not accurate. But the standard answer, I think, has been related to the fact that nominals have case. They have they might receive case, but the other categories do not. Which is also something that may have to do with respect to the distinction between arguments and adjuncts. Adjuncts do not typically have case; they don't participate in the agreement case system. So whatever the question whatever the answer we want to provide, the actual question should go back to the very basics about lexical categories and the distinction between nominals on the one hand, because I think they have a much more basic and important role. So depending on what theory of lexical decomposition you take, there are many authors that have argued that nominals, they are more primitive or more basic in the sense that other categories include nouns, like verbs include nouns, adjectives include nouns, but nouns they cannot be lexically decomposed, or if anything they have to involve this self-merge, some version of this self-merge or self-attachment operation. So I think the answer to all of these questions should make us find a question that actually goes back to the distinction between nominals on the one hand and other categories on the other hand. And the standard case of that has been a structural case. And actually, even that kind of approach, so the approach that tells us that nominals are different, they are special because they have case, I don't know if that's it's like a chicken and egg question, I think, at the same time. So what's actually, so what do we get, what do we gain by saying that nominals are special because they have case? So it's true that they have case, that other categories they don't, in principle, but so is that an actual explanation? So does that provide some kind of understanding of what is going on? That I don't know. So I don't know if Luigi wants to elaborate on that, or if we have no time left, Theresa.
I think actually, Ángel, you've ended up with such a big question, and yes, it's quite clear that this is a topic that could indeed be unbounded. So I think I'm going to call halt now, and thank you for having been such cooperative combatants and giving us such a stimulating discussion and debate. And thank you too for everybody who's asked questions. If we haven't asked your questions, please do send them through. They will get sent on to our combatants tonight. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand back over to Cecilia.
Thank you.
Well, dear friends and colleagues, I think we have all enjoyed our flash mob. I hope you will come to the next one. And the next one is actually, and the last one before the summer pause, will be on Thursday, the 2nd of July, same time, so 6:30 p.m. Central European Time. The topic is syntax semantics interface event structure. The two discussants will be Gillian Ramchand from University of Tromsø and Hagi Borer from Queen Mary University of London. And the moderator will be David Edger. So I hope to see you all in 3 weeks. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.